The night Dr. Daniel Hurst reset Elena Ashford's shoulder, he had been awake for 19 hours. He had treated a teenager with a broken wrist from a skateboarding fall, a retired teacher with chest pains that turned out to be stress and too much coffee, a construction worker with 3 cracked ribs from a job site accident who kept insisting he was fine while his face turned the color of old concrete. He had seen the full range of what one night in a Phoenix emergency room looked like, and none of it had surprised him. After 16 years as a Navy SEAL medic and 11 more as a civilian doctor, very little surprised Daniel Hurst anymore. He would later say that the night she came in, he should have known something was different from the first second. He did not know it yet, but some part of him already felt it. The emergency room doors opened at 2:14 in the morning, and the paramedics came through fast the way they always did when a case was serious but not yet critical. The woman on the stretcher looked like a car accident, which is exactly what they told him she was. Single vehicle, Highway 89 about 12 miles north of the city. She had struck a pine tree at speed, and the impact had been significant. Dark hair matted with blood on the left side of her skull, clothes torn at the left shoulder and both knees. No identification found at the scene. No phone, no wallet, nothing. The paramedic, a young man named Torres, who had been working the night shift for less than a year, gave Hurst the rundown with the practiced efficiency of someone still learning how to sound calm. She had been in and out of consciousness during transport. Vitals were unstable at the scene but had settled during the ride. Blood pressure low but holding. Pulse elevated. Possible concussion. Definite shoulder dislocation left side. Hurst was already moving alongside the stretcher before Torres finished talking. He looked at the woman the way he had been trained to look at patients, and also the way he had been trained to look at everything else. Quickly. Thoroughly. Without letting his eyes stay in one place too long. What he saw in those first 3 seconds was this. She was in her early 30s. Athletic build, even unconscious, even broken. The kind of muscle that did not come from a gym, but from sustained physical work over years. Her hands resting at her sides on the stretcher had calluses in the specific places that came from rope work and weapon handling. The scar along the inside of her left forearm was old, healed clean, the scar that a civilian doctor might attribute to a childhood injury or a kitchen accident. Hurst did not attribute it to either of those things. He had seen that scar on other people, on people he had served with. He noted all of this in the span of a breath and said nothing about it. The trauma bay was small and bright, and the nurses moved around the stretcher with the automatic coordination of people who had done this many hundred of times. Monitors were attached. The saline line went in, someone called out her blood pressure, and someone else wrote it down. The overhead light made everything look harsh and clinical and real in the way that emergency medicine always felt real, without softness, without the distance that allowed people to pretend that the body was not fragile. Hurst prepared to examine the shoulder. He had reset dislocated shoulders more times than he could count. In operating rooms with full equipment, in forward operating bases with almost nothing, twice in the back of moving vehicles under fire. The procedure was mechanical at this point, something his hands knew how to do without requiring much conscious direction from his brain. Position. Assess the dislocation. Apply measured pressure. Rotate the arm through the correct arc. Wait for the joint to seat. He bent over her, positioning his hands. Her eyes opened. Not the gradual, confused opening of someone coming out of sedation or unconsciousness. They opened the way a switch gets flipped. One moment, nothing. The next moment, fully present. She looked at him without the disorientation that almost every person showed in those first seconds after waking in an unfamiliar place. There was no scanning the ceiling to figure out where she was. There was no flinching back from the stranger leaning over her. What she did before she looked at Hurst's face was look at the door, then the window, then the 2 nurses on the far side of the room, then finally him. It took less than 2 seconds. If Hurst had been anyone else, he probably would not have noticed. He noticed. He said what he always said before a shoulder reduction. This is going to hurt for a moment. He said it to prepare her, but also to give her a chance to respond, to say something, to give him any indication of how much she understood about what was happening and what kind of help she might need. She did not respond. She looked at him. Her jaw was already set. He applied pressure and rotated the arm. The joint seated with the sound that always made first-year residents wince. There was nothing pleasant about it, and the nerve pain that preceded and followed a shoulder reduction was significant. Hurst had had his own shoulder dislocated during a training exercise in 2004, and he still remembered what those 3 seconds felt like. The woman made no sound. Her eyes went tight at the corners for a fraction of a moment. Her breathing changed, slowing and deepening in a way that was not natural, not instinctive, but controlled, deliberate, a technique applied consciously to override the body's urge to react. Then her jaw released the tension it had been holding, and she looked at Hurst with an expression that was simply neutral. He tested the range of motion gently. The joint was seated correctly. "That's better," he said. She nodded once. "Can you tell me your name?" She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said quietly, "No. Not I don't remember, not I don't know, just no," as though she understood the question perfectly and was making a considered choice about how to answer it. Hurst moved to examine the rest of her injuries. He kept his voice level and his manner routine the same way he always did with patients who were frightened or confused or unwilling to talk. He did not push. He assessed the head wound, which was superficial despite looking severe, the way scalp lacerations always did. He checked her pupils, which were equal and reactive. He palpated her ribs carefully and found two that were bruised, possibly cracked, none of them displaced. She had a laceration on her left knee that needed cleaning and closure. Throughout all of it, she tracked the room. That was the word for it. Tracked. Her eyes moved in the small, deliberate pattern of someone conducting ongoing surveillance, not the unfocused wandering of someone concussed and frightened. Every time a nurse moved to a different part of the room, her gaze followed and then returned to baseline. When the door opened briefly to admit the attending physician on duty, her attention went there, immediately assessed the newcomer in the time it took him to step through the doorway and then settled. Hurst filed all of it away and said nothing. The attending physician, Dr. Reeves, reviewed her vitals and agreed with the assessment. Concussion, bruised ribs, shoulder dislocation, now reduced laceration requiring closure. No internal bleeding visible on the initial scan. They would keep her for observation. He asked her name twice and received the same answer Hurst had received, which was nothing, and he noted it in the chart with the professional detachment that emergency physicians developed when they had seen enough of the world to know that people sometimes had good reasons for not wanting to be found. The nurses called her Jane. It was easier than calling her the patient in room 414. Hurst checked on her twice more during the remainder of his shift. Each time she was awake. Each time she was in the same position. Each time she watched him enter the room with the same careful assessing attention she gave to everything else. She did not ask for more pain medication. She accepted what was offered, took it with the efficiency of someone following a protocol rather than seeking relief, and returned to the same watchful stillness. By the time Hurst's shift ended at 7 in the morning, he had decided to come back. He slept for 5 hours. He came back at 1 in the afternoon, which was not required of him and which he could not entirely explain to himself. He told himself he was following up on an unusual case. There was some truth to that. When he walked past her room, he stopped. She was not in bed. She was standing beside the bed, and she was moving her left arm through a specific sequence of motions. Slow, deliberate, precisely controlled. Extension, internal rotation. A careful backward reach, then reverse. Each motion was held at the endpoint for a count before continuing. It was a rehabilitation sequence for a recently reduced shoulder dislocation, specifically designed to restore range of motion while minimizing the risk of re-injury. It was not a sequence that civilians knew. It was not the kind of thing a person found by searching online. It was the kind of thing that was taught formally as part of a medical training program oriented toward field injuries and rapid return to function. He watched her for 8 seconds. Then she stopped. Without turning around, without any visible sign that she had detected his presence, she simply stopped what she was doing and returned to the bed. By the time he stepped into the room, she was sitting against the pillow with her arm at rest, looking like a patient who had been resting quietly. He pulled up the chair beside the bed and sat down. "Those were military rehabilitation exercises," he said. He said it the way he might say the weather looks like rain. Neutral, observational, not a challenge. She looked at him for a moment. "I try to stay active. Movement helps healing." "It does," he agreed, "when done correctly. Most people don't know how to do it correctly." She said nothing to that. "Where did you learn that sequence?" She held his gaze steadily. "You pick things up. Life teaches you to adapt." He sat with him for a second. Life teaches you to adapt was not a phrase that civilians used casually. It was not lifestyle philosophy. It was the compressed, matter-of-fact language of someone who had spent years in environments where adapting was a survival requirement, not a personal quality. He had heard versions of it from men who had served in places that did not appear in news reports, who had done things that were not discussed in polite company, and who had come home carrying a specific kind of quiet that marked them permanently. He had heard it from people like himself. He looked at the scars on her forearms again. The old one on the inside of the left arm, two more on the right that he had not had the angle to see clearly the night before. One of them was consistent with a rope abrasion deep and healed with the slightly uneven texture that came from an injury that had not received proper care immediately afterward. Another was smooth and oval, the distinctive mark of a burn from a heated metal surface. He had seen that combination of scars before. He had seen it on men who had been held. He looked up and found her watching him look. Neither of them said anything. The afternoon security shift began at 3, and the guard who came on was a man named Rodriguez, a broad-shouldered, unhurried man in his mid-50s who had been working the hospital security detail for 4 years. Hurst had spoken to him dozens of times in the hallways. He knew Rodriguez had spent 22 years in the Army before retiring, though Rodriguez did not advertise it, and Hurst had only learned it by accident when they happened to watch the same news segment about a base closure, and Rodriguez's expression told a longer story than he intended. Hurst was in the hallway when Rodriguez made his rounds and stopped at the doorway of the room. "How are you feeling tonight?" Rodriguez asked. His voice carried the careful warmth of someone who had spent years learning how to make people feel safer than they were. "Better, thank you," she said. Then after a beat that was barely a pause, "Thank you for your service." Rodriguez's posture changed. It was small, but it was real. A slight straightening, a shift in his expression from professionally pleasant to something more genuine and more careful. "How did you know I was military?" "Just a guess," she said. Hurst stood in the hallway and did not move. It had not been a guess. He was certain of it. She had read Rodriguez the same way Hurst had been reading her, and she had done it in less than 3 seconds, through a doorway from a hospital bed, and she had identified something specific enough to give her the confidence to make a direct acknowledgement rather than a vague pleasantry. She knew what she was looking for because she had been the same thing. After Rodriguez continued his rounds, Hurst stepped into the room. She was already looking at the door when he came through it, which meant she had been tracking his position relative to Rodriguez's conversation, which meant her awareness of the building extended further than any patient had any reason for it to extend. He sat down in the chair. He said, "You recognized him." She said, "He has good posture." Hurst was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was Navy, Special Operations, 16 years as a SEAL medic before I moved to civilian medicine." He watched her face. What happened was small and would have been invisible to anyone who had not been watching for it. A fraction of a release. Not relief exactly, something more like recalibration. The subtle internal shift of a person who has been holding a specific tension and has just been given a reason to adjust it. She looked at him the way he had been looking at her for the past 20 hours. Directly. Measuring. "The shoulder," she said. "You reset it like someone who had done it under bad conditions." "I've done it under bad conditions." "How many times?" "More than I can give you an accurate number for." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she said, "Elena Ashford." He did not react. He just waited. "Lieutenant Elena Ashford," she said. "Army Special Operations, medical specialist and field surgeon. At least, that's what I was." "When did you get out?" She looked at him for a long moment. The room was quiet except for the steady signal of the monitors and the distant sounds of the floor outside. "I didn't," she said. "Not officially." He waited again. "According to the Army," she said, "Lieutenant Elena Ashford was killed in action 18 months ago." The statement settled in the room like something physical. He kept his expression neutral. He had learned that skill in environments where showing surprise could cost you information or trust or something more consequential. He kept his face still and his voice level, and then he said, "But you're here." "I'm here," she agreed. She told him carefully. Not everything and not all at once. She told him the way a person told things when they had spent a long time deciding what could be safely said and to whom, and she was still in the process of making that calculation about him. 3 years ago, she had been part of a joint special operations mission. The objective was the extraction of a high-value intelligence asset in a region where the terrain was difficult and the support structures were thin. The intelligence going into the mission had been precise. It had shown the asset's location, the security arrangements around him, the optimal extraction route, the expected resistance, and the window of time during which the operation had the best chance of succeeding cleanly. The intelligence had been wrong. What the team found at the target location was not an isolated asset with minimal security. What they found was a prepared position with multiple armed personnel who knew the team was coming and had taken time to arrange themselves accordingly. The first exchange of fire happened before the team had fully registered that something was wrong, and by the time they had reoriented and begun moving toward cover, 3 people were down. She said this plainly without the emotional processing that Hurst sometimes saw in veterans who had not yet found a way to organize their worst memories into usable language. She said it like a report which told him something about how many times she had gone over it in her own mind. She had kept 2 people alive who would otherwise have died in the first minutes of the contact. She had made the calls that she had been trained to make under the conditions that the mission had actually presented, and when the team reached the extraction point, she had brought everyone who could still walk to the line. The mission was a failure. The asset was not recovered. 3 team members were dead. The after-action report, which was written without her input, in which she was shown only after it had been finalized, concluded that her errors in medical assessment during the early phases of the mission had contributed directly to the team's casualties. It described a series of decisions that she had not made in a sequence of events that had not occurred. The evidence that might have corrected the record had been altered. Radio logs, medical reports, and witness statements from surviving team members had all been changed in ways that were internally consistent and presented a coherent narrative that bore no relationship to what had actually happened. She had fought it through every channel available. She had written formal objections and requested reviews and filed complaints and made every procedural move that the system provided for situations where the system itself had gotten something wrong. None of it had moved. The record stood. 6 months after the mission, during a nighttime water training exercise, Lieutenant Elena Ashford had not returned from the water. The search had been thorough, but the conditions were poor, and the current in that section of river had a documented history of carrying things away from where they started. A body was not recovered. That was not unusual given the conditions. It was logged and processed, and Elena Ashford was listed as killed in action, and the file was closed. She had been watching Hurst throughout all of this, not performing, not presenting, watching to see what he did with each piece of information as she put it in front of him. He sat with the full shape of what she had told him. He understood the architecture of it. He had been in the military for 16 years, and he had seen the machinery of institutional self-protection operate in ways that were both mundane and terrible. He had seen men credited for things they had not done and blamed for things they had not done, and he had seen the point at which an individual's account of events became irrelevant to the institution's need for a coherent narrative. He also understood that what she was describing, if it was accurate, was not simply a bureaucratic injustice. Someone had not only destroyed her career and driven her to fake her own death, someone had watched the intelligence for that mission fail in a very specific way and had not been surprised by it. Someone had known what the team would find at that target location because someone had told the people waiting there that the team was coming. He said, someone fed bad intelligence into the mission deliberately. That's what the evidence suggests, she said. What evidence? She reached into the small bag of personal items on the bedside table and removed an object that looked like a standard USB drive. She set it on the table between them, but did not push it toward him. Financial records, she said, bank transfers, shell company formations, procurement records for equipment that never reached its listed destination. 18 months of work. She paused. Enough to document that someone in Special Operations Command has been moving weapons and intelligence to non-state actors for at least 3 years. He looked at the drive without touching it. He understood what he was looking at. The people who wanted that drive and wanted Elena Ashford silent were not people who made small decisions or took limited actions. They had already arranged the deaths of 3 soldiers and the institutional destruction of a 4th and the classified death of a 5th. The scope of what she was describing meant that the people responsible had resources and reach and the willingness to use both without hesitation. He was about to speak when a sound from the hallway made him stop. He had spent 16 years developing the habit of tracking ambient sound without consciously directing his attention to it, and the sound that reached him now was small but wrong. It was a pause. A footstep sequence in the hallway outside that stopped where it should not have stopped, in the section of corridor that had no room. Entrances, no supply stations, no reason for anyone to stand still. He turned his head and looked through the narrow window beside the door. The man in the hallway was wearing civilian clothes, which was not unusual for a visitor. He was carrying a small bunch of flowers, which was exactly what a visitor carried. He was standing at a point in the corridor where a person delivering flowers to a patient would have no reason to stand. And he was looking at the door of room 414 with the focused attention of someone conducting an assessment, not the distracted look of a man searching for the right room number. Hurst had carried that same expression himself. He knew precisely what it meant. The man looked at the door for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked toward the elevator bank, unhurried the flowers hanging at his side. Hurst turned back to Elena. She was already sitting up. Not alarmed, not frightened. Alert. Her eyes were on him with the full steadiness of someone who had been waiting for this moment and had already thought through what came after it. She said, "You saw someone." It was not a question. He stood up from the chair and moved to the door and turned the lock. The small click of it seemed very loud in the room. He turned back to her. He was outside for about 12 seconds. Hurst said, "Military bearing. Too much attention on this door for someone who had business anywhere else on this floor." She nodded slowly. "They found you," he said. "They found me before," she said. "This is the third time in 6 months." She said it the way someone stated a fact about weather or traffic. Not without weight, but with the flatness of a person who has processed a fear so many times that it has become something other than fear. He looked at her. He thought about what it meant that she had been running for 18 months and that she had been found twice before tonight and that both times she was still here. "How did they find you this time?" "I made a mistake," she said. "I was close to having everything I needed. I let myself move too quickly. 3 weeks ago, I accessed a records database that I should have left alone for another month. It flagged, and they traced the access point back to a general area, and then they started looking." She paused. "The accident on Highway 89 was not an accident. They ran me off the road, and I had about 4 seconds to make a decision. I chose the tree." He stood with that for a moment. He had watched the security footage earlier that afternoon after his shift before he went home to sleep. He had gone to the security office on the second floor and asked to review the footage from the ambulance bay and the east entrance for the early morning hours, using the pretext of following up on patient intake procedures. The staff had been accommodating. He had watched Elena's stretcher come through the doors, and then because something had been pulling at him since the night before he had asked to see the footage from the parking area and the approach road. The footage showed the ambulance arriving. It showed the empty highway beyond the entrance, quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. And it showed in the parking lot at the edge of the camera's range, a dark SUV sitting without its lights on for 40 seconds before moving away. A vehicle that had followed the ambulance at distance and then peeled off before entering the camera's clear field. He had not mentioned this to anyone. He had sat with it for 6 hours telling himself he was uncertain, telling himself there were explanations, telling himself that he was a doctor in a civilian hospital and not a man who made decisions based on 6-hour-old security footage and the way a patient's eyes moved. He looked at Elena Ashford sitting in the hospital bed with her shoulder newly reset and her expression completely steady and her hands loose in her lap with the practiced looseness of someone who had learned to stop gripping things that weren't there to hold. He thought about what she had said. She had made a decision in 4 seconds in a car at speed on a dark highway, and the decision she had made was to hit the tree rather than the guardrail because the tree was on the right side of the road and the guardrail was on the left and the SUV was coming from the left and hitting the tree at the controlled angle. She had chosen meant impacting at approximately 40 miles per hour with the front corner of the vehicle absorbing most of the energy which was survivable. She had calculated all of that in 4 seconds. And now she was sitting in a hospital bed waiting to see what he would do. He said, "We need to get you out of here." She looked at him. "Not tonight," he said, "but soon. Tomorrow at the latest. If they know you're here, this room is not safe, and the hospital is not safe, and waiting for your discharge papers to process through official channels is not something we have the time for." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." And then she said, "I've been waiting for you to say that since this morning." He looked at her. "I watched you come back this afternoon," she said. "You were not on shift. You came back on your own time, and then you stood in the doorway for 8 seconds before you came in." She paused. "I've been trying to decide if I made the right choice." He said, "What choice?" She held his gaze. "This hospital," she said. "This floor, your shift." He understood then, in the way that some realizations arrive not gradually but all at once, that she had not been carried to Mercy General by chance or by the routing decisions of an ambulance dispatcher. While a vehicle was trying to force her off a dark highway and she had 4 seconds to choose a direction, she had already known where she was going to end up. The room was very quiet. He said, "How long have you been watching me?" She said, "Long enough to know you were the right person." He looked at the locked door. He looked at the USB drive still sitting on the table. He thought about what he was and what he had been, and what the 16 years had cost him and given him and left him with. He thought about the 3 soldiers who had died in a valley in a place he had never been because someone had decided their deaths were an acceptable cost for something else. He thought about Elena Ashford spending 18 months alone with what she knew running and working and being found and surviving that twice and still being here. He thought about the man in the hallway with the flowers and the way he had looked at the door of room 414 like he was solving a problem. He picked up the USB drive and held it for a moment. Then he set it back down on Elena's side of the table where it belonged. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'm going to make a phone call." The phone call took 11 minutes. Hurst made it from the stairwell at the east end of the fourth floor, standing in the fluorescent half-light, with his back to the wall and the door propped open 2 inches so he could hear the corridor. He had Garrett Wills's number from memory, the way he had memorized a small collection of numbers that he had never entered into any phone because the people attached to those numbers were the kind of people whose contact information you did not want sitting in a device that could be lost or taken or read by someone else. Wills picked up on the second ring. That was one of the things about Garrett Wills. He always picked up. In 12 years of knowing him through 2 combat deployments and a decade of civilian life, Hurst had never once reached his voicemail. He gave Wills the name. Elena Ashford, Army Special Operations Medical Specialist, listed as KIA approximately 18 months ago. He gave him the physical description and the specific combination of skills and training markers he had been observing for the past 20 hours, and then he stopped talking and let Wills work. There was a silence on the line that lasted a little over a minute, which Hurst knew from experience meant that Wills was not thinking about the question, but was already moving through the channels he maintained for exactly this kind of inquiry. Wills had spent 22 years as a Navy SEAL before building a private security firm that did the kind of work that government agencies sometimes needed done by people who did not appear on any agency roster. He had access to information that did not officially exist through relationships with people who did not officially have those relationships. When Wills came back on the line, his voice had changed slightly, not alarmed, more careful. "She's real," he said. "The record says what she told you. KIA 18 months ago, non-recoverable, remains closed file." A pause. "But 3 weeks ago, her name came up on a circulation list I have access to through a contact at a private intelligence contractor. The kind of list that gets circulated when someone with resources wants something handled quietly." Hurst stood very still in the stairwell. "What kind of list?" he said, though he already knew. "Neutralize," Wills said. "Should give her name a physical description and a last known geographic area. Central Arizona." Another pause. "Daniel, they didn't find her after the accident. They were already looking for her before it. The accident was them." Hurst thought about the SUV in the parking lot footage. He thought about the man with the flowers. "She's been found twice before," he said, "in the last 6 months." Wills was quiet for a moment. "And she's still standing." "She's still standing. I'll get people positioned, but whatever you're planning, it needs to happen fast. If they have eyes on the hospital already, the window is short." Hurst said he understood. He ended the call and stood in the stairwell for a moment longer, not moving, letting the information settle into the part of his mind that processed threat assessments, the part that had never fully switched off even after 11 years of civilian medicine, the part that had occasionally frustrated former colleagues and a former wife, and had tonight, for the first time in a long time, turned out to be exactly the right tool for the situation. He went back to room 414. Elena was awake. She had not been asleep, and he suspected she had not tried to be. She was sitting in the same position he had left her in, and the USB drive was still on her side of the table, and her eyes came to him with the same quality of attention they always did, steady and measuring and fully present. He sat down in the chair. He told her what Wills had said. He gave her all of it, including the neutralized list, including the 3-week timeline. He watched her face while he talked. She received the information without visible disruption. A brief tightening around her eyes when he mentioned the 3-week timeline, and he understood that she was calculating backward, identifying the specific actions she had taken that had created the flag confirming the sequence of events that had led to the highway and the SUV in the tree. When he finished, she said, "I accessed a records database, personnel files from a joint contracting operation that ran through a military logistics hub in Texas. I used a masked connection, but I went back to the same source twice in 4 days. That was the mistake." "What were you looking for?" "Confirmation," she said. "I had the financial records. I had the transfer documentation. What I needed was the personnel link, the name of the specific individual in Special Operations Command who authorized the transfers." Which, as she paused, "I found it on the second access, and then I moved." "Did you get out of the area?" "I left Flagstaff and came south. I had 3 possible locations pre-identified in Phoenix. I'd done background work on each of them over the previous months. This hospital was one of them. He held her gaze for a moment. He said, "Wills can get people into position, but we need a reason to move you that doesn't raise flags inside the hospital. If someone is watching for unusual activity around your room, a standard discharge request at 2 in the morning draws the wrong kind of attention." She nodded slowly. She had already been thinking about this. "An allergic reaction," she said. He said, "severe enough to justify emergency transfer to a specialist facility, fast enough that no one has time to make calls before we're moving." "What would you use?" "Histamine solution, carefully measured. The symptoms will be visible and significant. The reaction is reversible with standard antihistamines and corticosteroids, which I'll administer during transport. You'll feel unpleasant for about 40 minutes. She looked at him with something that was not quite a smile. "I felt unpleasant for longer than 40 minutes. He knew she was not talking about a medical procedure. He said, I need you to tell me about the 14 months. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "How do you know about that?" "The scars," he said. "The rope abrasion on your right forearm, the burn on the same arm, the way you controlled the pain from the shoulder reduction." He paused. "I've seen that combination before. I've treated men who came back from captivity." She looked at the window for a moment. The parking lot outside was still and orange-lit and ordinary. She said, "Before Afghanistan, a different operation. Our extraction was compromised, and I was separated from the team. I was held for 14 months before I was recovered." She said it plainly with the compressed language of someone who had done the work of organizing terrible things into sentences that could be spoken aloud without coming apart. "It changed what I could tolerate, physically, and in other ways." He did not push further. He did not need to, and she did not need him to. What he understood, sitting in that room, was the full architecture of who was in front of him. A woman who had been taken and held for over a year and had come back from that, who had returned to operational status and deployed again and walked into an ambush that had been prepared for her team and had kept people alive who would otherwise have died and had come home to find her name attached to their deaths, who had fought it through every legitimate channel and found every channel closed, who had spent 6 months in the army after that carrying what she knew until she reached the conclusion that the only way to survive was to stop existing. And then she had spent 18 months alone running and working, being found and surviving that twice, and she had come to Phoenix with a specific destination already chosen. He said, "The plan requires you to trust that I know what I'm doing with the medical part." "I already trust that," she said, "and it requires Wills's people to be in position before we move." "How long does he need?" "A few hours." She nodded. She looked at the USB drive on the table, and then she looked at him and she said, "I want you to understand something before we do this." He waited. "The drive is not the only copy," she said. "The financial records, the transfer documentation, the personnel files, all of it was uploaded to an encrypted server before I came to Phoenix. The access credentials are not written down anywhere. They exist here." She touched her temple briefly. "If something happens to me before this reaches the right people, the server address and the credentials are in a letter with a civil liberties attorney in Washington, D.C., with instructions to open it if I haven't made contact within 30 days. He looked at her. "I've been doing this for 18 months, she said. "I've thought about what happens if I don't make it." He said, "What's on the drive then?" "A partial copy of the financial records only. Enough to be convincing, not enough to be complete." She paused. "If someone takes it from me, they'll believe they have what they need. They'll spend time verifying it. That buys time." He understood. The drive was a tool. She had thought about every scenario in which she might not succeed and had built a contingency into each of them. She had not come to Phoenix hoping to survive. She had come to Phoenix with a plan that could succeed even if she did not. He said, "Get some rest. I'll come back when Wills is ready." She said, "Daniel." It was the first time she had used his name. He paused at the door. She said, "I don't need you to carry this for me. I need you to stand beside me long enough for it to reach the people it needs to reach." He looked at her. "Understood," he said. He came back at 2:47 in the morning. The fourth floor was quiet. The overnight staff moved through their routines with the unhurried efficiency of people accustomed to the silence of a hospital in the hours before dawn. Hurst walked the corridor at the pace of a physician doing a late check, which he was in the sense that he had privileges in this building and a patient in this room, and if anyone had stopped to question his presence, he had a sufficient explanation for all of it. No one stopped him. He had the syringe in the inside pocket of his jacket. He had called Wills back at midnight and confirmed the timing. Wills had two people in position, one of them posing as an EMT in an ambulance staged at the east entrance, one of them in a secondary vehicle a quarter-mile from the hospital. The destination was an isolated property 40 miles north off any map that mattered. Elena was already awake when he came in. She was dressed in the clothes the hospital had cleaned for her after the accident, sitting on the edge of the bed with her feet on the floor and her back straight. She looked like someone waiting for a signal, not a patient who had been disturbed in her sleep. He held up the syringe. She extended her arm without being asked. He administered the injection and stepped back. Within 4 minutes, the reaction was visible. The flush came first, moving up her neck and across her face with a speed that looked alarming, even to someone who knew what was causing it. Then the swelling around her eyes and lips, mild but visible. Her breathing changed, developing the slightly effortful quality that histamine produced in the airways. Not dangerous, not close to dangerous, given what he had prepared to administer as the counteragent, but convincing in the way that physical symptoms were always convincing. He opened the door and called out with the controlled urgency of a physician managing a crisis. The response was immediate. 2 nurses came at a run. The attending on duty followed 30 seconds later. The room filled with the organized momentum of a medical team responding to an emergency, and Hurst was at the center of it, directing administering the antihistamine and corticosteroid doses that would begin reversing the reaction, speaking in the measured cadence of someone who had seen this before and knew exactly what needed to happen next. He said they needed to transfer her to the regional medical center across the city. He named the facility. He said it had an allergy and immunology unit equipped to manage this presentation, and that he had already called ahead and they were ready to receive her. He said he would accompany her to ensure continuity of care. The attending physician looked at Elena and looked at the monitors and looked at Hurst, and he saw a physician he had worked alongside for 3 years recommending a course of action with clinical authority, and he agreed. 20 minutes later, Elena was on a stretcher, moving toward the ambulance bay. Hurst walked beside her, one hand on the side rail. Her face was still swollen, her breathing still audibly effortful, but her eyes were tracking the corridor around her with the same steady attention they always had. As they passed through the final set of doors into the cold pre-dawn air, he felt her hand find his briefly on the rail. A single pressure 1 second long, then released. The ambulance was where Wills had said it would be. The man behind the wheel was a former SEAL named Crawford, who had worked with Wills for 6 years. The second man, who had come around from the rear of the ambulance to help Hurst transfer Elena from the stretcher to the gurney, was named Doyle. Hurst had met Doyle once before 3 years ago at a function he did not want to think about right now. Doyle was competent and quiet, and his eyes moved the way everyone's eyes moved in this particular group of people, constantly efficiently noting and discarding and noting again. The ambulance pulled away from the hospital. Hurst administered the second dose of antihistamine and sat across from Elena as the city moved past outside the small windows. Her breathing was already improving. The swelling was beginning to recede. She was looking at the ceiling of the ambulance with the focused expression of someone tracking each phase of a plan they had been thinking about for a long time. He said 40 miles, 40 minutes. She said good. Crawford's voice came from the front at the 4-mile mark. He said it the way people who had seen serious things delivered serious information, without inflection, without alarm, which was exactly the tone that made the words more rather than less significant. "We have company," he said. 2 vehicles, black SUVs, maintaining separation but matching every turn. Hurst felt the change in the air inside the ambulance. Not panic, the specific shift that happened in enclosed spaces when trained people received information that required their skills, and there was no longer any question about whether those skills were going to be needed. Elena sat up from the gurney. She said, "They had someone in the hospital." She said it without surprise, without revision. She said it like someone confirming a hypothesis. Not staff, a patient. 4th floor, probably admitted in the last week. "I noticed a man on day 2 who spent too long in the hallway between rooms without purpose. I couldn't confirm it without exposing myself." Crawford said, "We're not going to make the safe house with these vehicles behind us. They're going to make a move before we get there." Wills's voice came over Crawford's phone on speaker. He had been monitoring their route. He said, "There's a truck stop on the I-17 service road 2 miles ahead. Pull in. Enough civilian presence to complicate a direct approach. My second vehicle will reposition." Crawford pulled in. The truck stop was bright in the darkness, lit for the long-haul drivers who moved through at every hour of the night. 4 18-wheelers in the lot, a scattering of smaller vehicles, a diner showing lights through its windows. Crawford positioned the ambulance near the main building, 2 exit routes clear, a third possible with adjustment. He and Doyle took positions without being directed. Hurst helped Elena down from the back of the ambulance. She moved carefully, assessing the space with each step, taking in the geometry of the lot and the positions of the other vehicles and the location of the building entrances. She had stopped looking like a patient the moment they left the hospital. She looked like what she was. The 2 SUVs had entered the far end of the lot and parked without their lights going off. 2 men got out of the lead vehicle. They walked across the lot with the unhurried, deliberate pace of people who had decided that there was no longer any reason for concealment and who were confident in the outcome of what was about to happen. Civilian clothes, nothing visible in their hands. The kind of men who did not need to carry anything visible to communicate what they were. They met inside the main building of the truck stop in the wide corridor between the diner and the convenience store, under fluorescent light that made everything look equally tired and equally real. The man who spoke first was in his mid-40s, with a face that had spent time outdoors in difficult conditions. He spoke to Hurst first, which told Hurst something about how they had assessed the situation and what they thought about who was in charge of it. He said, "Dr. Hurst, we need to talk." Hurst said, "About what?" "About Ms. Ashford," the man said, "and about a misunderstanding that has led to an unfortunate situation." Elena moved a half step forward, not dramatically. She simply moved until she was standing beside Hurst rather than behind him, and the man's eyes adjusted to her accordingly. She said, "There's no misunderstanding." The man selected his response from among several he had prepared. "The information you have been gathering for the past 18 months is part of a picture you don't have full context for. There are operations at levels you weren't read into. What looks like misconduct from your position is considerably more complex." Elena said, "Selling weapons to organizations that have used them to kill American personnel is not complex. It's treason." Hurst had been working the room. He had counted 6 people total from the 2 vehicles. 2 in front of him, 2 more who had entered through a secondary entrance and positioned themselves near the back corridor. A 5th was visible through the diner glass, seated at the counter with his back to them, which was positioned wrong for a customer. A 6th he had not yet located but expected near the main entrance. He caught Doyle's eye across the room. Doyle had tracked the same positions. Crawford was near the entrance. The first man said, "Ms. Ashford, you have an impressive record in genuine service to this country. There is a path forward here that doesn't end with anyone getting hurt. Come with us. Bring the information you have. Let people with the full picture explain to you what you're actually looking at." Elena said nothing for a moment. She reached into her jacket pocket. Everyone in the room moved in some small way. The automatic physical response of trained people to an unexpected hand movement in a tense situation. Hurst did not move because he had been watching her hands and had noted the moment she decided to do whatever she was about to do. She removed the USB drive. She held it up between her fingers, and the fluorescent light caught it, and for a second, it was the only thing anyone in the room was looking at. Then she threw it. She threw it hard and flat, the way someone threw something they wanted to travel distance rather than land nearby, and it skittered across the linoleum floor of the convenience store corridor and disappeared under a bank of vending machines at the far end with a small plastic sound that seemed very loud in the sudden stillness. What happened next happened the way things happened when trained people had been holding tension and a release point arrived suddenly. 2 of the 6 moved toward the vending machines without thinking, which was exactly the wrong response, and exactly the response that someone who understood how these people were trained would have predicted. The man at the diner counter turned around. Crawford moved. Doyle moved. Hurst grabbed Elena's arm and they went left through the door marked "Employees Only" that she had identified and indicated to him with a single look 4 minutes earlier when they first entered the building. And then they were in the kitchen, which smelled of old grease and industrial cleaning solution, and there was a line cook at the far end who looked up with an expression of complete bewilderment, and they went past him and through the fire door at the back. The parking area behind the building was dark and cold and smelled of exhaust and asphalt. Wills's second vehicle was coming in from the service road with its headlights off, moving fast. It stopped 10 feet from them, and the rear door opened, and Hurst pushed Elena in first and followed. From inside the building behind them came the sound of something falling, then shouting, then the flat, distinct report of a handgun, and then another. Crawford came through the fire door 20 seconds later, moving fast with a cut above his left eye bleeding freely down the side of his face. He got into the front passenger seat and said, "Go." The vehicle moved. Hurst looked at Elena. She said, "Wills." As if she had spoken him into the phone, Wills's voice came through the speaker. He said he was 2 minutes out. He said Crawford should go north on the service road. He said there was a problem. He said Doyle took a round in the shoulder. He's in my vehicle. He's going to make it. A pause. But Owen got out before I could reach him. Hirsch said, "What do you mean he got out?" Wills's voice was careful in the way it was careful when he was managing something difficult. He said, "Owen Strickland. He's been with my firm for 2 years. I put him on this detail this morning." Another pause. "He had a tracking device in his jacket. I found it on him before we left the truck stop. He didn't put it there himself. It was put on him." Hirsch felt the information land. He looked at Elena. She was not surprised. She said, "His daughter." There was a silence from the speaker. She said, "He has a daughter. How old?" Will said 9. She said, "Where is she now?" A longer silence. Then Will said, "I'm working on that." Elena sat with this for a moment. The vehicle was moving north, the highway opening up ahead into darkness and scattered lights. Her face in the dim interior was still, and focused in the way Hurst had come to understand was not coldness, but concentration. She was not reacting to the situation. She was several steps ahead of it. She said, "Don't cut Strickland off." Will said, "He's compromised." She said, "He's compromised, and he knows he's compromised, and he doesn't know that we know. That's not a liability. That's a channel." She paused. "Whatever position Harlan is trying to establish in the next 3 hours, he's going to be feeding information through Owen to get there. Let him feed it. And then we decide what Owen tells him." Silence on the phone. Then Will said, "You already thought about this." She said, "I thought about what a person does when someone has something they love. And I thought about what I would do if I were that person and someone gave me a way out that didn't require choosing between my child and my conscience." She looked at Hurst. She said, "Get Owen on the phone. Tell him we know about the tracker and we know about his daughter, and then listen to what he says before saying anything else." Hurst was about to answer when Crawford said from the front seat, "We need to stop." He said it with the flat evenness that competent people used when things were urgent and precision mattered more than emotion. He said, "Doyle is in Wills's vehicle, and Wills is 2 minutes behind us. But the way Wills is driving Doyle is worse than he said." They stopped on the service road at the base of an overpass where the darkness was complete except for the lights of both vehicles and the distant orange glow of the highway interchange. Hurst was out before the vehicle had fully stopped. Wills opened the rear door of his vehicle. Doyle was conscious, which was better than the alternative, holding his right hand pressed hard against his left shoulder, which was soaked through. His face was the color that faces went when a body was working hard to compensate for blood loss. He looked at Hurst with the expression that said he was still present and still functional, and did not want anyone to treat him as though he were not. Hurst got in beside him and did what could be done with what he had. A field compression dressing from the trauma kit in Wills's vehicle. Pressure. Assessment of the wound path, which appeared to have missed the subclavian artery by a margin that was either skill or luck. And in either case was the reason Doyle was still talking. He worked in the dark with a penlight clenched between his teeth, and he was aware of Elena standing beside the vehicle outside her eyes on the road behind them, watching for headlights with the patient vigilance of someone who had learned that surviving required doing the immediate thing completely and not borrowing trouble from the next minute until the present one was handled. When he had the dressing placed and the pressure constant and Doyle's color beginning to stabilize, he sat back. Elena appeared in the doorway. She looked at Doyle, then at Hurst. She said, "Will he make it to the safe house?" Hurst said, "If we move now." She said, "Then we move now." She said it the way she said everything, with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned in the hardest possible way that there was no version of survival that did not require deciding to move forward before you were entirely ready and before all the information was in. She put her hand briefly on Doyle's arm. She said, "You're going to be fine," he said through clenched teeth with the half-grim expression of a man trying not to show how much things hurt. "Yes, ma'am." She stepped back from the door. Hurst looked at her in the darkness beside the overpass with the cold coming off the desert and the highway interchange glowing in the distance and the 2 vehicles idling and the evidence of everything they had just come through spread around them, and he thought about what she had said in the hospital room about standing beside her long enough for the truth to reach the people it needed to reach. He thought about the USB drive under the vending machine in the truck stop, the decoy, the misdirection she had been prepared to execute from the moment she decided to move. He thought about the server somewhere in the architecture of the internet behind a wall of encryption that only she could open, holding 18 months of evidence that had already survived 2 attempts to stop it from existing. He thought about Owen Strickland, somewhere behind them in the dark carrying information that could go either direction depending on what someone gave him a reason to do with it, and about Elena's voice when she had said listen to what he says before saying anything else. He climbed out of Wills's vehicle and walked back to his own. He got in. Crawford put the vehicle in gear. The road north was dark and straight, and the safe house was 30 miles ahead, and the next thing that needed to happen would wait exactly as long as they needed it to wait and not 1 second longer. The safe house was a single-story property on 40 acres of high desert, set back from a dirt road that did not appear on any map that most people used. It had a well generator and the kind of silence that existed only at sufficient distance from everything else. Wills had used it before for purposes he had never described in detail, and that Hearst had never asked about, and it was exactly what the situation required, which was a place where nothing could approach without being seen and where no one had a reason to look. They arrived at 4:23 in the morning. Doyle was moved to the back bedroom, and Hearst spent 40 minutes doing what could be done with the supplies in Wills's equipment case, which were considerably better than what had been available on the roadside. The wound was clean through no arterial involvement, the bone intact. Doyle would need a hospital and a surgeon within the next several hours, but he would make it to both. He was conscious and coherent and complained about the pain with the dry humor of someone who had been hurt before and understood that complaining was a form of proof that they were still present. Will sat at the kitchen table with a compress on a cut above his knuckle and his phone in his hand and the expression of a man managing several things at once. Crawford had taken a position outside covering the approach road because that was what Crawford did without being asked. Elena sat at the table across from Will's. She had the laptop open. It was Will's machine, encrypted running through a series of proxies he maintained for field work. She had asked for it without explanation, and he had handed it over without question, which told her something about what Wills had already concluded about who was running the operation. She typed for 7 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "It's done." Wills looked up. She said, "The server. I've initiated the transfer to a secure drop that my attorney in Washington has standing instructions to forward to the FBI field office upon receipt. She'll receive it within the hour, the full file. Financial records transfer documentation, procurement, falsifications, and the personnel authorization chain." She looked at the screen for a moment. "All of it." Will said, "Who's the primary contact at the FBI?" She gave him a name and a division. He wrote it down. He said he had a secondary contact in the same division and would make a call at 6 in the morning to confirm receipt and ensure the file was moving to the right people and not sitting in a queue where it could be delayed or redirected. She nodded. She closed the laptop. She sat back in the chair and placed her hands flat on the table, and for the first time since Hearst had met her, she was still in a way that was not tactical, not the stillness of someone maintaining awareness and conserving energy. Something quieter, the stillness of a person who has been carrying a specific weight for a very long time and has just set it down. He watched her from across the kitchen and said nothing because there was nothing to say that was equal to the moment. She sat that way for about a minute. Then she stood up and asked Wills where the coffee was. Owen Strickland arrived at the safe house at 6:15. Wills had called him the previous hour after Elena had outlined exactly what she wanted said, and in what order and what the goal of the conversation was. She had been precise and specific, and Wills had listened without interrupting and then had made the call. Strickland came in with the look of a man who had been awake all night and had spent most of it with something terrible sitting in the center of his chest. He was in his mid-30s, broad through the shoulders, with hands that did not know what to do with themselves. He looked at Wills first, and then at Hearst, and then at Elena, and whatever he had been expecting. It was not what he found, which was 3 people sitting at a kitchen table with coffee. He said, "My daughter." Elena said, "Sit down." He sat. She said, "Your daughter is fine. Wills has people at your sister's house in Scottsdale, where she's been staying for the last 3 days. She has been watched continuously since 9 o'clock last night, and she will continue to be watched until this is finished." She paused. "Harlan's people put a tracker on you because they needed to know where we were going. They used your daughter as the lever because they had enough information about you to know it would work. That was their calculation." Strickland's jaw was tight. She said, "I'm not going to ask you to explain yourself. I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly." He waited. She said, "When Harlan's people contacted you, what did you tell them about the plan?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The hospital, the fake transfer, the ambulance." He looked at his hands. "I didn't tell them the destination. I didn't know the destination when they first contacted me. I told them the truck stopped because Crawford called it out on the radio and they were monitoring the frequency. She nodded slowly. She said, "The tracker they put on you, do you still have it?" He reached into his jacket pocket and set it on the table. A small device the size of a thumbnail. She looked at it, then at Strickland. She said, "At approximately 6:45 this morning, you're going to send a message through the channel Harlan's people gave you. You're going to tell them that the group split up after the truck stop, that Hurst and the woman went north on the I-17, that you lost visual, but the direction was consistent with the Flagstaff area." Strickland frowned slightly. She said, "You're going to send that message because it will move whatever assets Harlan has in this region 3 hours north of where we actually are. And because by the time they reach Flagstaff and determine the information was wrong, the FBI will have had this file for 4 hours and the window for anyone to do anything about it will be closed." She slid the tracker back across the table to him. He looked at it. He looked at her. He said, "And then?" She said, "Then you cooperate fully with federal investigators when they contact you. You tell them everything. Harlan's contact method, what you were asked to do, what you told them, what leverage they used, all of it." She paused. "Your daughter needs you to still be a person she can look at in 20 years. Strickland picked up the tracker. He held it in his palm for a moment, and whatever he was working through was private and large, and Hurst did not look away from it because it seemed like the kind of moment that deserved a witness. Then Strickland closed his hand around it and nodded once. The FBI arrived at the safe house at 11:40 in the morning. They came in 3 vehicles, exactly the number Elena had told Wills to tell them to bring from the direction she had specified, and without the additional personnel that would have indicated someone further up the chain was trying to control what happened rather than respond to it. Will stood at the gate and watched them come and reported their approach with the same flat economy he used for everything else. And by the time the lead vehicle stopped in front of the house, Elena was already at the door. The agent in charge was a woman named Harbor, in her late 40s, with the face of someone who had listened to a great number of difficult things and had learned to receive them without the expressions that made people feel either judged or managed. She shook Elena's hand, and then Hurst's, and then looked at the property, briefly taking inventory. And then she sat down at the kitchen table and opened her laptop and said, "We've had the file for 4 hours and 50 minutes. I have 17 people in the building behind me who have been reading it since it arrived." She looked at Elena. "We need you to walk us through the authorization chain, starting with the Afghanistan operation." Elena sat across from her. She said, 3 years ago, and then she told it completely without the omissions she had made when she told Hurst, without the protective compression of someone still deciding how much to trust. She told it the way a person told something when they had finally reached the place where they could say all of it and know that it was going to the right destination. Hurst sat near the window and listened. He had heard the outline. Now he heard the full structure of it, and the full structure was considerably worse than the outline. The intelligence failure in Afghanistan had not been a failure. It had been a transaction. The asset the team was sent to recover was a civilian procurement officer named Aldridge, who had spent 2 years helping move military equipment through a series of shell companies to buyers who were not supposed to have it. Aldridge had decided that what he knew was worth his freedom, and he had made contact with a defense intelligence officer who had passed the information up the chain. The chain led to Colonel Victor Harlan. Harlan had understood immediately that Aldridge was not an asset to be recovered. He was a liability to be eliminated, and the most efficient way to eliminate him was to send a team to do it without the team knowing that was what they were doing. The altered intelligence guaranteed that the team would arrive at a location where the people waiting had been told they were coming. 3 soldiers died in the opening minutes of a contact they could not have anticipated. Aldridge died in the same contact. The mission was a failure on paper. Everyone who needed to be silenced was silenced, and the team members who survived needed to be managed. Elena had been the managing. She said all of this flatly, without performance and without the grief that came from telling a wound. She said it the way she had reset her own shoulder in the hospital room at 3 in the morning, as though it were a procedure that needed to be executed correctly, and the fact that it hurt was relevant but secondary. Agent Harbor asked questions. Her colleagues in the doorway took notes. Hurst watched Elena's hands on the table and thought about 14 months in captivity and an ambush on a hillside and 18 months alone in a country that had officially decided she was dead, and he understood something about the nature of a certain kind of courage that had nothing to do with dramatic moments and everything to do with the decision to continue when continuing was the harder choice. The formal arrest began at 2 in the afternoon. Hearst heard about them through Wills, who was monitoring the Federal Communications Channel through a contact at the field office. Harlan was taken into custody at his residence outside Colorado Springs at approximately the same time that 14 other individuals were taken into custody at locations across 4 states. By 4 o'clock, the number was 22. By 7 o'clock, it was 31. The news coverage started within the hour of the first arrest. It was careful and incomplete, as early coverage of federal operations always was built from official statements and informed speculation, and the urgency of journalists trying to frame something large and complicated quickly enough to beat competing outlets. The phrases that appeared most often were Special Operations Command and weapons trafficking, and arriving later than the others and landing differently when it did decorated officer. Elena watched none of it. She was in the back room with Doyle, who was awake and lucid and had graduated to complaining about the quality of the safe house's instant coffee, which Hearst took as a reliable indicator that he was going to be fine. She sat in the chair beside the cot and they talked in the low, easy way of people with a shared vocabulary who did not need to fill silence and were not uncomfortable when they did not. Hearst stood in the hallway and watched her for a moment. He thought about the man in the hallway of the 4th floor of Mercy General Hospital, holding a bunch of flowers and looking at the wrong door with the wrong kind of attention. He thought about the truck stop and the fluorescent light and Elena throwing the USB drive across the linoleum with the precise, flat trajectory of someone who had made that decision before she made any other decision and was executing it on a timeline she had already calculated. He thought about 18 months. He thought about what a person became when they had no one to stand beside them for that long and still kept going. The grand jury convened within 3 weeks. The federal case was large and complex and moved with the momentum of an investigation that had been handed a complete file on the first day. The evidence Elena had assembled over 18 months was meticulous in the way that the work of a person with no margin for error was always meticulous. Every transfer documented, every shell company traced, every procurement record cross-referenced against the delivery records that contradicted it. The authorization chain was clean and clear and led in a single direction. Hearst testified before the grand jury in the 4th week. He described what he had observed in the hospital and what he had done and why. He described the man in the hallway. He described the SUV in the parking lot footage. He described the pursuit on the highway north of Phoenix and the truck stop and the night on the service road under the overpass. He spoke for 2 hours and answered every question directly, and when he was finished, the prosecutor thanked him, and he walked out of the federal building into the afternoon sun and stood on the steps for a moment and thought about nothing in particular. Strickland received a deferred prosecution agreement 3 weeks after the arrests. He had cooperated fully as Elena had said he would, and the information he provided about Harlan's contact network closed 3 additional investigations that the FBI had not known to open. His daughter came home from Scottsdale on a Tuesday morning. He drove to pick her up himself. He did not discuss what had happened, and she was 9 years old and asked no questions that required difficult answers. He went back to work for Wills 6 months later. Wills hired him back without discussion, which was how Wills handled most things that mattered. The trial began 5 months after the arrests. There were 34 defendants. The proceedings were complex and ran across multiple courtrooms in 2 jurisdictions. But the primary trial, the one that carried the weight of the case and the weight of public attention, was the one in which Colonel Victor Harlan sat as the central defendant. Harlan was 61 years old. He had been decorated 4 times. He had commanded men in 3 conflicts across 2 decades. He was the kind of officer whose career had become a story that the institution told about itself, a living demonstration of what sustained excellence in service looked like. And what made the trial genuinely terrible was not simply what he had done, but the length of time over which he had been doing it while the story continued to be told. The courtroom was full on every day of the proceedings. Elena sat at the prosecution table not as a defendant, not as a civilian observer, but as a reinstated officer who had been formally cleared of all charges relating to the Afghanistan operation and who was present as a material witness with standing. She had been reinstated quietly without ceremony in a brief administrative proceeding 3 months before the trial began. The reinstatement had received a paragraph in the military press and a longer treatment in several investigative journalism pieces following the broader story. She had received it without public comment. Hearst was in the gallery on the day that the prosecution called Major Dennis Croft. Croft was 53 years old, and he was among the 34 defendants. His charge was not weapons trafficking and not conspiracy to commit murder. His charge was falsification of official military records, obstruction of a federal investigation and accessory after the fact to the deaths of 3 service members. He had been Harlan's administrative officer during the period following the Afghanistan operation. He had received the after-action report in its original form, which documented the actual sequence of events accurately, and he had returned it with specific notations indicating what needed to be changed and in what direction. And he had received the revised version and signed his name to it and forwarded it up the chain. He had known exactly what he was signing. He sat in the witness box with the stillness of a man who had spent 5 months preparing for this moment and had discovered that preparation did not make it smaller. His attorney had negotiated a cooperation agreement, and so he told the truth, and the truth was precisely as damaging as the documents and evidence had suggested it would be. When the prosecutor finished, Croft's eyes moved across the courtroom in the way that people's eyes moved when they had been carrying something heavy for a longer time and were looking for a place to set it down. They found Elena. She was looking at him. She had been looking at him, Hearst realized, since the moment Croft took the stand, with the same steady and specific attention she gave to everything that required it. Not cold, not furious, not any of the things that would have been understandable and perhaps even forgivable, given what his signature had cost her. She was simply looking. Croft held her gaze for a moment that seemed considerably longer than it was, and then he looked at the floor and he did not look up again for the remainder of his time in the witness box. Hearst watched Elena's hands in her lap. After a moment, they unclenched. He thought that was probably all the accounting that was going to happen between those two people, and that it was in some ways more complete than anything a courtroom could have provided. Harlan was convicted on all primary counts. The judge, a man in his late 60s who had spent 30 years on the federal bench and had the manner of someone who had heard enough human behavior to have very few illusions about it, addressed Harlan before sentencing with the specific language that judges used when they wanted the record to be clear about what they were looking at. He talked about the nature of the trust that had been placed in the defendant by the institution and the people it represented. He talked about the soldiers whose deaths were a direct consequence of the transactions the defendant had authorized. He talked about the years. Harlan received 25 years. He listened to the sentence with his hands folded on the table and his face arranged in the expression of a man who had decided sometime before this moment that the outcome was acceptable. Hearst watched him and found that he had nothing particular to feel about it. What he felt was quieter and less specific than anger or satisfaction, something closer to the feeling of a long calculation arriving at its correct answer. The courtroom began to empty. Hearst made his way down from the gallery. Elena was gathering papers from the prosecution table, moving with the efficient precision that characterized everything she did, stacking documents and sliding them into a case with the attention of someone who did the work in front of them, regardless of the weight of what surrounded it. When she looked up and saw him approaching, she stopped. She said, "How are you?" He said, "Better." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Walk with me." They went out through the side corridor and through the building's glass doors into the afternoon. The sky over Phoenix was high and pale blue, the kind that existed in the desert in the hours after noon, and the sun was warm and the air was dry, and it was an ordinary afternoon in every way that an afternoon could be ordinary, which struck Hearst as both unremarkable and, given the past 5 months, somewhat extraordinary. They stood on the steps. He said, "What's next for you?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the street below. People moved past with the business of people who had places to go and no awareness of what had just concluded inside the building behind them. She said, "They're sending me back as an advisor to a medical unit working in the region, rebuilding trust with local populations through healthcare access." A pause. Apparently, having someone who exposed corruption in the command structure is considered an asset when you're trying to convince people that the institution can be trusted. He said, "That's a significant amount of faith to put back into something that did what it did to you." She considered this. She said, "It's not faith in the institution. It's faith in the individual people inside it who are trying to do the work correctly." She looked at him. "There's a difference." He said, "I've been talking to an organization, emergency medical services in conflict areas and post-disaster zones. Former military medical personnel working through a civilian framework." He paused. "They need people who can function in difficult conditions and who understand both the medical and the operational sides of a situation." She said, "That sounds like exactly what you should be doing." He smiled slightly. He said, "That's what I thought." They stood in the afternoon for a moment without speaking, the way people stood who did not need to fill the space between them. Then she said, "There's something I should have told you before now." He waited. She said, "The night of the accident, Highway 89. She looked at the street below, not away from him, but at the middle distance where people looked when they were choosing their words carefully. "I told you that I chose Mercy General because I had identified it as one of 3 possible locations in Phoenix. That was true, but it wasn't the full answer." He said nothing. She said, "I had been researching your background for 3 weeks before I came to Phoenix. Your service record, your transition to civilian medicine, your position at Mercy General, your schedule." She paused. "I knew which shifts you worked. I knew your training. I knew that you had no institutional affiliations that would create a conflict of interest and that you had no dependents that could be used as leverage against you." She paused again. Mercy General was not the closest hospital to where the accident happened. It was the destination I had already chosen before I got in the car that night. The afternoon was very still around them. He sat with this for a moment. It came to him all at once rather than gradually, the way certain realizations arrived, not built piece by piece, but delivered whole in the space between one breath and the next. She had not been carried to Mercy General by chance. The ambulance routing the hospital selection, his shift schedule. None of it had been circumstance. While a vehicle was trying to force her off a dark highway, and she had 4 seconds to choose a direction, she had already known where she was going to end up. He thought about the way she had looked at him when he first entered her room, the quality of the assessment she had applied to him, and how he had attributed it to the general vigilance of a person in her situation. He thought about the moment she had said his name and how it had sounded deliberate in a way he had not been able to identify at the time. Knowing all of this did not reduce what she had been through, or what it had cost her, or what she had built from what it cost her. It did not make the decisions feel less like decisions. What it did was complete something, fill in the last shape in a picture that had been missing it since the night she arrived on a stretcher in his emergency room and opened her eyes and looked at the door before she looked at him. She had not needed rescuing. She had needed a witness, and she had chosen one. He said, "You planned around my schedule." She said, "I planned around every variable I could control. You were one of them." A pause. "I needed someone who understood the military world well enough to believe what I was telling him. Someone with the medical skills to help me manage my condition after the accident. Someone without ties to the institutions involved." She looked at him directly. "And someone with the specific kind of character that chose to come back on his day off to check on a patient he didn't need to check on." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How did you know I'd do that?" She said, "I didn't, but I thought you might, and I needed someone who might." He looked at her. There was nothing performed in her face. There was only the direct, steady attention she had given to everything from the beginning, the quality that had first made him understand that something was different about the patient in room 414, something that required him to keep returning. He thought about what she had said in the hospital room in the first hour of their real conversation, about what she needed from him. Not rescue, not protection, just the presence of someone standing beside her long enough for the truth to reach the people it needed to reach. He understood now that she had engineered the conditions for that. She had built it into her plan from the beginning, the way she had built in the encrypted server, and the attorney in Washington, and the decoy USB drive, with the same meticulous attention to the variables she could not fully control but needed to work in her favor. He said, "If you ever find yourself in a position where you need someone to stand beside you again." She said, "I know where you work." He smiled at that. A real one, the kind that arrived without calculation. She picked up her case from where she had set it on the steps beside her. She straightened. She looked at the street for a moment, and then she looked at him, and there was something in her expression that he had not seen there before. Something that was not quite peace, because he did not think peace arrived cleanly for people who had lived the way she had lived, but something adjacent to it, something that belonged to people who had done the thing that needed doing and had come out the other side still standing. She said, "Don't waste the second act." Then she walked down the courthouse steps and into the afternoon. He watched her go. He stood on the steps for a long time after she disappeared into the city, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once, the way you stood when something large had passed through your life and left it fundamentally different from what it had been before. He thought about the organization and the call he needed to make. He thought about what it meant to choose something rather than arrive at it by default, which was a distinction that had not always been clear to him and which now seemed like the most important distinction there was. He thought about Elena Ashford driving into a tree at 40 miles an hour in the dark because it was the best available option. And he thought about how the best available option was sometimes not a comfortable thing, and sometimes not a safe thing, and was always in the end the only thing worth doing. He walked down the steps. He walked to his car, parked half a block from the courthouse on an ordinary street in an ordinary city on an ordinary afternoon that was not ordinary at all. And he sat behind the wheel with his hands in his lap and the engine off. He took out his phone. He scrolled to the number he had been carrying in his contacts for 3 weeks without calling the director of the emergency medical organization, and he looked at it for a moment. Then he pressed it. It rang twice. Someone answered. He said, "My name is Daniel Hurst. I was told to call when I was ready." Outside the windshield, the city moved through its afternoon with the unremarkable momentum of a world that did not know what had just concluded inside a federal building on the other side of it. Cars passed, people walked. The sky over Phoenix was high and pale, and the light was the light of the American Southwest in the late afternoon, gold and flat, and going on for a long time. He said, "I'm ready."